The war room was ready before dawn. A canvas headquarters tent sat low against the damp European air, lit by shaded lamps so the glow would not travel beyond the perimeter. On the table lay the Allied front in fragments, maps creased at the folds, grease pencils lined up like instruments, pins bristling along roads and rivers. Staff officers gathered with clipboards and tin cups of coffee. It was the ordinary ritual of modern war, information made visible, decisions made orderly. Yet one chair remained empty, pulled back slightly as if its owner had risen mid-briefing and never returned. They used a familiar phrase to explain it. General George S. Patton had gone forward. It sounded like initiative. It sounded like courage. But when Eisenhower's headquarters asked the simplest question, where exactly, answers weakened into guesswork. A liaison had last seen his staff car near a crossroads in the dark. A courier claimed he was with the lead elements. A radio operator said he had tried to raise Patton's frequency and heard only the thin hiss of static, the sound of distance turning certainty into rumor. A young staff officer, tired enough to speak plainly, muttered the number the way men speak of weather moving in. 300 miles. Not an exaggeration for effect, but a measured span, far beyond the expected radius of command. 300 miles was the length of an entire campaign in older wars. Here, it was the gap between an army and the man supposed to steer it. In that number lived everything headquarters feared: delayed orders, misread boundaries, fuel sent to the wrong road, artillery firing on assumption instead of coordinates. Eisenhower did not reach for anger. He read absence the way he read maps, looking for what it meant, not what it felt like. Patton's empty chair could be interpreted in two directions at once. It could be initiative, the kind that turned hesitation into motion, and motion into opportunity. It could also be indiscipline, a habit that made victory depend on personality rather than method. Patton's brilliance was real. So was the risk that brilliance could outrun the system that fed it. Outside the tent, the war did not pause for legend. Engines ran, dispatch riders waited, telephones rang with requests that needed a signature and a timestamp. The headquarters machine kept moving, but it moved with a missing gear. In coalition war, where British and American forces shared roads, air support, and political patience, uncertainty spread quickly. Authority eroded quietly when a commander could not be located, not through mutiny, but through hesitation. And hesitation, multiplied across a front, became danger. The Germans were still fighting, still building rear guards and ambushes. Yet the Allies faced another enemy as well: the temptation to let legend outrun procedure. Patton's myth promised that speed could solve everything. But myths do not answer radios. And now Eisenhower had to decide what mattered more: momentum or the integrity of command itself, because the next decision would define whether Patton's disappearance was genius or the first crack in a system built to win. Patton did not believe a war could be directed from a chair. To him, command was not a set of reports arriving on a desk. It was a physical act, like riding a horse into the sound of battle. A general belonged where danger could be translated into motion, where fear in a young soldier's face could be answered with a voice, a gesture, a decision made in the same air the men were breathing. He had seen too many plans collapse under the first hard contact, and he concluded that the only honest place to lead was close enough to feel the ground change under the tracks. That belief shaped everything about him. Patton distrusted distance and paperwork because distance created illusions and paperwork created delay. He trusted eyesight, terrain, and the sound of guns because those things did not flatter a commander. A map could tell you where a river ought to be. A river in flood told you what was real. A staff estimate could predict German resistance. The crack of an 88 and the sudden silence afterward taught you more, faster, and without mercy. To the men at the front, this style could feel like salvation. Patton's presence made soldiers feel seen. It told them their exhaustion was not invisible, that their suffering mattered enough for the highest authority to share a piece of it. When his vehicle appeared, dusty, urgent, moving with purpose, it simplified the war down to a single order: keep going. But what lifted the line forward often hollowed the center behind it. Staff officers, trained to make wars coherent, felt abandoned when their commander became a rumor traveling on incomplete signals. 300 miles was not only a distance, it became a symbol. It meant Patton treated headquarters as a tool, not a home, a place to collect fuel and messages before returning to the edge where he believed history was being decided. In his mind, systems existed to enable the will of a commander. The staff existed to turn his instinct into action. If the system slowed him, then the system, not Patton, must be wrong. On the roads at night, that philosophy took a literal form. A driver followed Patton's staff car through blackout conditions, headlights hooded, villages passed like shadows. The road signs were half visible, the air tense with the possibility of ambush. The driver could feel it. Patton was not traveling to a specific coordinate so much as chasing the front like a scent, drawn forward by the idea that speed itself was a weapon. Yet modern war did not only reward will. It demanded systems, signals, logistics, boundaries, coordination, so thousands could move as one without colliding. Patton's method created momentum, but it also created uncertainty, and uncertainty was contagious in an army built on schedules and supply lines. And that was where the collision waited, inevitable as a turning road, because Eisenhower's war was coalition discipline, and discipline, in the end, depended on a commander being predictably where he was supposed. Dwight D. Eisenhower did not command only an army. He commanded an agreement. His authority was military in title, but political in function. An architecture built to hold nations together under strain, to keep British and American priorities moving in the same direction, to prevent victory from being undone by rivalry. He understood that a coalition was not a natural creature. It had to be maintained daily, with patience, with clarity, and with decisions that considered not only the battlefield, but the fragile confidence behind it. His headquarters was designed accordingly. It was not a tent full of maps. It was a machine for coordination. Air power had to be synchronized with ground advances. Supply lines had to be protected and timed. Boundaries had to be drawn so allies did not collide in the same valley or starve each other on the same road. Personalities had to be managed as carefully as divisions: Montgomery's caution, Bradley's steadiness, Patton's fire. Even the press, waiting for angles and names, was part of the equation. In Eisenhower's war, the front line was only one layer. The war behind the war, logistics, diplomacy, narrative, was equally decisive. That is why a disappearance did not feel romantic to him. When a major commander vanished from the expected chain of contact, the machine lost a gear. At first, it looked minor: one meeting delayed, one boundary question left hanging. But in modern war, small delays became large risks. A convoy might turn down the wrong road. An airstrike might be scheduled without the latest positions. Neighboring units might advance on assumptions instead of orders. The battlefield did not punish disorder with embarrassment. It punished it with casualties. Eisenhower tolerated boldness. He needed it. The Allied advance required commanders willing to push, to exploit cracks, to move before the enemy could recover. But he could not tolerate confusion that spread across armies like smoke. Confusion did not stay local. It migrated through headquarters, through liaison officers, through the tight seams where coalition forces met. And once uncertainty entered those seams, it widened them. In the signals corner of the tent, the problem became audible. A communications officer tried to raise Patton on multiple nets, calling, switching frequencies, sending repeat requests with increasingly formal language. Each attempt returned the same answer: static, broken tones, and silence where certainty should have been. It was not merely inconvenience, It was the sound of a system losing sight of one of its most powerful instruments, and that revealed the rule Eisenhower lived by. In coalition war, freedom of action existed only when it remained legible to the system that supported it. An army could grant initiative, but it could not survive mystery. So the cold open question sharpened in Eisenhower's mind, as precise as a pin on a map: was Patton's disappearance the secret to victory, or the first seed of catastrophe waiting to bloom behind the lines? Patton's method was rewarded by the only currency armies truly respect: results. Every mile taken without pause felt like confirmation that caution was the real enemy, not the German. In the summer and late summer of 1944, when the Allied front finally broke free from the hedgerows of Normandy and began to pour into open country, speed became intoxicating. Roads opened, towns fell in sequence. Resistance, when it appeared, often arrived too late to matter. For Patton, the war seemed to reveal its secret at last. Movement was not merely a tactic, it was a form of control. He believed collapse could be made permanent by pursuit. German units, battered and disorganized, still had one advantage: time. If given a pause, they could regroup behind a river, rebuild a line, and turn an open road into a killing ground. Patton's answer was simple and relentless: never allow the enemy to reform, never allow the front to solidify. A continuous push could keep German commanders reacting instead of planning, improvising instead of preparing. It was a theory of war that treated hesitation as mercy offered to the wrong side. In that logic, distance became a weapon. Patton did not see 300 miles as an irresponsible separation from headquarters. He saw it as a statement of tempo. If he was already ahead, the enemy had to look over his shoulder. If he was already beyond the last reported position, German staff work, already strained by Allied air power, partisan activity, and broken communications, had to chase him like a shadow. He understood that modern armies fought not only with steel, but with rhythm. If he could move faster than their rhythm, he could unmake their order without necessarily annihilating their units. And then there was the element Patton trusted most: presence. He treated his own arrival like a fuel no depot could issue. A general stepping onto the road shoulder, boots dusty, voice hard and immediate, could lift exhausted units into one more push. Soldiers who had been running on habit suddenly ran on pride. Men who had stalled at the edge of a village moved again when they saw the famous helmet and the polished pistol grips. Patton believed leadership was not something transmitted through paperwork. It was contagious, and it spread best at close range. A tank crew might be halted beside a hedgerow or a crossroads, engines clattering at idle, waiting for orders that never seemed to come fast enough. Then Patton's vehicle would appear, fast, abrupt, as if it belonged to the forward edge by nature. For a moment, the war became simpler. There was no long debate about boundaries or supply charts. There was only the instruction implied by his presence: attack, move, win. In that clarity, men found energy they did not know they still possessed. But seduction has a cost, and the arrogance it breeds often arrives quietly. Patton began to believe his instinct was faster than any staff system could ever be. He had watched cautious planning waste opportunities, and he concluded that planning itself was the waste. The more his forward motion produced victories, the more he trusted the method and discounted the machinery behind it: the radios, the convoys, the boundary lines, the patient coordination that made speed sustainable. And so the irony took shape. The general who valued tempo above all was now creating uncertainty in the very network that supplied tempo. He was outrunning not only German recovery, but Allied clarity. In the maps back at headquarters, the front advanced, but the question remained: could Patton's speed be harnessed without breaking the system that made his speed possible? At the front, speed felt like victory. At headquarters, speed without coordinates felt like exposure. Staff officers did not ask for a commander's location out of curiosity. They asked because modern war was built on clarity, routes marked and deconflicted, boundaries agreed so formations did not collide, supplies timed so fuel and ammunition arrived where need would be, not where it used to be. A moving army was a living organism, and headquarters was its nervous system. When the signal from a major limb stopped returning, the whole body began to move less confidently. Patton's absence turned coordination into guesswork. And guesswork, in war, was not a harmless error. It became artillery falling short because a line had moved. It became convoys arriving late because the destination had shifted without notice. It became an air mission called in on a grid square that was now occupied by friendly vehicles. Even when catastrophe was avoided, efficiency bled away. Fuel was burned in detours. Hours vanished in clarifying phone calls. Opportunities, those brief openings that existed only for a morning or an afternoon, closed while officers tried to confirm what should have been obvious, where the commander was and what he intended to do next. Inside Eisenhower's headquarters, the advisors did not agree on what the silence meant. Some believed Patton's forward presence was essential, that his method was the reason German resistance seemed to crumble ahead of him. They argued that certain commanders could not be treated like ordinary instruments. Patton, they said, was a weapon that worked only when released. Others saw something darker in the same behavior: dangerous vanity, the belief that a famous general could substitute his own instincts for the machinery of coalition war. They did not question Patton's courage. They questioned his reliability, because reliability was what kept thousands alive when maps and reality began to diverge. The coalition dimension sharpened every worry. British leaders watched American command habits carefully, sensitive to any sign that momentum might be valued over coordination. Americans, in turn, watched British criticism carefully, wary that caution might be used as leverage over strategy. In such an atmosphere, one missing commander could become more than a tactical inconvenience. He could become a political irritant, a talking point, a reason for trust to thin. Coalition war did not fall apart from one dramatic betrayal. It frayed from repeated small confusions that made partners doubt each other's control. In the middle of this, a liaison officer sat with a blank sheet and wrote a message designed to sound courteous. Politeness was a form of camouflage. The language would be respectful, recognizing achievements, avoiding accusation, yet the meaning underneath would be unmistakable. Report your location, not a suggestion, not a friendly check-in, a warning delivered in the grammar of professionalism, because that was how headquarters enforced discipline without lighting a public fire. And here was the deeper truth, the one staff work teaches and battlefield romance often forgets. Discipline is not the opposite of initiative. It is the condition that makes initiative usable. A bold move that cannot be understood cannot be supported. A breakthrough that cannot be supplied cannot last. The more daring the advance, the more it depends on the invisible order behind it. By now, the risk was no longer theoretical. The Germans might not need to defeat Patton in battle. They might only need to let him run, farther, faster, until his columns reached the point where fuel, ammunition, and clear coordination could no longer catch up. And in that widening gap, the legend would finally meet a quiet enemy he could not outdrive: logistics. Eisenhower did not fear aggressive commanders. He relied on them. In 1944, with the Allied armies stretched across France and the promise of final victory still separated by rivers, weather, and German resilience, boldness was not a luxury, it was a requirement. Yet Eisenhower also carried a responsibility that no battlefield triumph could replace. The Supreme Commander's first duty was not to produce glory, it was to prevent chaos. A coalition at war could survive setbacks. What it could not survive was a collapse of coherence. He saw Patton as a powerful instrument, perhaps the sharpest in his arsenal, but an instrument all the same. And instruments had to remain connected to the orchestra. Brilliance could not play solo in coalition war, not without distorting the entire composition. One commander rushing forward might feel heroic from the inside of a staff car, but Eisenhower had to listen for the whole front. British formations on one flank, American armies on the other, air power overhead, supply columns threading through ruined roads. When Patton became unreachable, it was not merely Patton who vanished. It was a portion of the orchestra falling out of time. So Eisenhower framed the issue as responsibility rather than temperament. A general at Patton's level was not simply a man making personal choices. He was a symbol, a lever, a piece of the alliance's public faith. If Patton were captured, killed, or cut off, if he disappeared not into legend, but into disaster, the shock would not remain local. It would ripple through the coalition like an explosion in a confined room. Newspapers would not print the nuance of operational risk. They would print the headline. Allies would not debate the exact circumstances. They would feel the sudden doubt. If even Patton can vanish, what else is not under control? In one quiet moment, Eisenhower stood over the map and looked beyond the pinned front lines. He saw not only arrows and bridges, but the speed at which victory narratives could turn into scandal. A triumphal story depended on competence. Competence depended on procedure. And procedure depended, in the end, on commanders being reachable. Modern war was fought in two arenas at once, the battlefield and the mind of the public. Eisenhower understood both. He understood that propaganda did not need to invent failure. It only needed a real confusion it could enlarge. He also understood morale and how fragile it could be. Patton inspired soldiers with a particular kind of certainty, hard, direct, contagious. But that same intensity could inflame critics and provoke rivals. Inside Allied command, personalities were not ornaments, they were forces. A commander who made men move could also make allies bristle. Eisenhower's task was not to choose between brilliance and stability, but to prevent brilliance from becoming instability. And that led to the moral truth at the center of his command. The higher the position, the less it belongs to the self. A private could take risks for his own courage. A general's risks were never his alone. They were paid for by fuel convoys, by infantrymen, by neighboring armies that had to adjust, by nations whose trust could be weakened by one uncontrolled headline. The pressure now gathered into a simple conclusion. Eisenhower had to speak, because if he did not, silence would become permission, and permission, in an army of ambitious men, would normalize indiscipline until the day the system broke at the exact moment it was needed most. 300 miles was not only a number whispered in headquarters. It became a technical problem with teeth. Radios that carried crisp orders at 50 miles became unreliable at 200, then meaningless at 300 as terrain, atmospheric conditions, and the simple crowding of the airwaves turned clarity into fragments. Couriers, those human threads still needed in a mechanized war, lost time to destroyed bridges, detours, traffic jams, and enemy aircraft. Roads, never designed for an army's appetite, choked with competing priorities, fuel tankers pushing forward, ambulances pulling back, artillery columns grinding through villages where rubble narrowed the lanes to a single file. Patton's forward command produced speed where it mattered most to the eye, the lead elements. Tanks crossed intersections before German staff could mark them on a map. Infantry rode trucks into towns that had expected a siege and instead received a sudden arrival. At the front, it looked like the perfect modern offensive: movement, surprise, relentless pressure. But behind that forward edge lay the longer, quieter reality of war, where victory had to be transported in 5-gallon cans and wooden crates. Supplies could not admire momentum, they had to find it. Logistics was the language the battlefield always translated into, sooner or later. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts. Without them, speed became stranded metal, a column of vehicles sitting useless beside a road while the enemy recovered. A tank without gasoline was not a weapon. It was a heavy promise that could not be kept. An armored division that outran its repair capacity might take ground today and lose its strength tomorrow, not from German fire, but from mechanical exhaustion. Patton's method could seize distance, but distance demanded payment, and the bill was always delivered to the supply chain. Somewhere behind the front, in a makeshift depot of tarps and stacked jerry cans, a supply officer bent over a map with a pencil worn down to a stub. He had convoys en route, drivers waiting for destinations, schedules written in ink that reality was already smearing. A message came in. Patton had moved again. Not a full location, not a grid reference, only a direction and a rumor. The supply officer tried to reroute the convoys toward an uncertain point, watching hours evaporate with every decision. A wrong turn meant miles wasted. Miles wasted meant fuel burned. Fuel burned meant the spearhead would soon be asking for what the road had consumed. The Germans understood this vulnerability even when they could not halt the advance outright. They did not always need to hold a town if they could delay a column. Rearguard actions, small ambushes, bridges blown at the right moment, these were not gestures of bravery so much as calculations. A single disabled truck in a narrow village street could back up traffic for hours. A few mines could force engineers to work while the clock ran, and when Allied coordination was uncertain, the effect of such disruptions multiplied. Confusion magnified every German delay until it felt larger than the enemy's strength. That was the revelation modern war delivered without sentiment. It punished leaders who outran their own communications as harshly as those who advanced too slowly. Speed could be decisive, but only if it remained connected, if orders could reach units, if supplies could reach the orders, if the system could still see the moving front. Patton's lead elements continued to win ground, pushing deeper into the open spaces of the campaign. Yet behind them, the machinery that made those wins possible began to fray. Quietly at first, then with a growing strain that even momentum could not conceal. Patton's restlessness was not only ambition, it was psychology shaped into doctrine. He feared stagnation the way other men feared artillery, because he believed stillness gave the enemy time to breathe. Delay to Patton was not a neutral pause, it was a moral failure, a softness that allowed German units to recover and prolong the war. In his mind, momentum was mercy. Every day gained was lives saved. Every mile taken was one fewer mile a soldier would have to fight for later. That belief made him relentless, and it made him impatient with anything that could not keep up. But behind Patton's urgency stood a staff living in a different reality. Their job was not to feel the battle. It was to translate a commander's instinct into orders that thousands could execute without confusion. They had to build the bridge between vision and movement, draft instructions, assign routes, define boundaries, coordinate artillery and air support, ensure fuel and ammunition were sent to the right place at the right hour. Patton could outrun paperwork, but armies could not. The staff did not exist to slow him. They existed to make him possible. In the cramped spaces of field headquarters, the human cost of his forward obsession became visible. Staff officers slept in short bursts beside radios, boots still on, heads dropped onto maps and typewriters. They woke to static and rumors, the thin, unreliable sound of a war moving faster than its own record-keeping. One message said Patton was near a river crossing. Another suggested he had already passed it. A third contradicted both. In the time it took to confirm a location, the location could change again. The scale of modern war revealed itself in those moments. One man's absence at the top did not merely inconvenience a meeting. It disrupted thousands of synchronized actions. A division's timetable depended on a corps boundary that depended on an army-level decision that depended ultimately on knowing where the commander was and what he intended next. When that knowledge dissolved, coordination did not fail dramatically. It failed quietly, through hesitations, duplicated efforts, missed opportunities, and a growing sense that the system was chasing a moving shadow. Eisenhower, far above this daily exhaustion, received updates in fragments, enough to worry, not enough to control. He could see the advance on the map, but not the decision-making behind it. He could measure distance, but not certainty. The Supreme Commander, responsible for coherence across nations and armies, was being forced into the posture he hated most, reacting to incomplete information. And that exposed the deeper truth. Charisma was powerful. It could lift men. It could simplify fear into action. But it did not replace the invisible labor of coordination, the patient work that kept momentum from turning into misdirection. Patton's personal method was nearing its limit, the point where boldness stopped being a weapon and began to look like recklessness. And somewhere between the static on the radios and the pins on Eisenhower's maps, the coming confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was approaching. Eisenhower's problem was not simply Patton's behavior. It was the fact that Patton's behavior worked until it didn't. That made correction delicate. A blunt reprimand could restore procedure, but it could also bruise momentum, and momentum was precious in a campaign that still depended on speed. Eisenhower understood that in coalition war, leadership was rarely a matter of issuing the strongest order. It was a matter of choosing the order that held the system together while the war was still in motion. So his staff began to design a corrective approach with the care of engineers adjusting a running machine. It had to be firm enough to restore predictability, reachability, accountability, clear command presence, but subtle enough not to turn Patton into an offended spectator. They knew his temperament. They knew he heard limits as insult, and insult as challenge. If Eisenhower framed the issue as personal disobedience, Patton might comply outwardly and resist inwardly. The correction had to land as principle, not humiliation. The levers they chose were quiet, almost bureaucratic in appearance, but powerful in effect. Liaison channels were strengthened, British and American officers positioned to monitor, interpret, and relay Patton's movements with greater fidelity. Boundaries were clarified with more precision, not as a criticism of Patton's judgment, but as a protection against collision. And supply, the most persuasive language in any army, became a tool of discipline. Convoys could be prioritized, rerouted, or delayed in ways that signaled the same message without shouting it. The system will support you fully when it can see you. In a back corner of the headquarters tent, a message was drafted and redrafted until every line carried the right weight. It had to contain praise, because praise acknowledged reality. Ground had been taken, Germans had been pushed, opportunities exploited. But it also had to insist on accountability, because accountability was the condition for future support. The language would be measured, almost elegant, admiration without surrender, correction without contempt. It was the kind of writing that looked harmless on paper and yet could change a commander's behavior. This was Eisenhower's leadership at its most distinctive, an innovation of restraint. He was not trying to dominate Patton. He was trying to keep Patton useful. In a war full of strong men, Eisenhower's strength was the ability to command powerful personalities without publicly breaking them. He knew that humiliation created new problems, bitterness, faction, a commander more focused on his pride than his orders. His goal was to preserve the relationship while enforcing the rule. He could already anticipate Patton's reaction. Patton would accept orders because he understood hierarchy and believed, in his own way, in duty. But he would resent limits that felt like mistrust, especially from a headquarters he considered too distant from danger. He would argue with results. He would speak the language of victory. And beneath that argument would be the deeper conflict. Patton believed presence at the front was leadership. Eisenhower believed reachability was leadership. That was the revelation Eisenhower's staff lived by. Command is sometimes the art of adjusting a general like a weapon sight. A millimeter of correction at the rear could prevent a mile of error at the front. Small adjustments, clearer boundaries, stricter reporting, tighter liaison, could avert the kind of large miss that ended in friendly collisions, stalled offensives, or political scandal. Now the struggle phase narrowed toward its unavoidable moment. The systems had been tightened, the quiet levers set in place. All that remained was the human exchange that would give those measures their meaning. Eisenhower's words to Patton about disappearing, and Patton's answer when the system finally demanded he be found. The reckoning did not arrive with shouting or spectacle. It arrived the way decisive moments often do in headquarters, through accumulated strain finally given a voice. Eisenhower had tolerated Patton's forward methods because he understood what they produced: broken German timetables, liberated towns, a sense of relentless Allied pressure. But now he confronted the hard reality that victories, however valuable, could not justify habits that endangered coordination. In a coalition war, a commander was not judged only by what he took from the enemy, but by what he preserved within his own side: clarity, trust, and control. Eisenhower framed the problem as systemic, not personal. Missing commanders created gaps, and gaps were invitations. The enemy could exploit them with rearguards and ambushes. Allies could misinterpret them as carelessness, or worse, as a refusal to cooperate. A front was not merely a line of fighting units, it was a network of assumptions shared across armies. When one node vanished, the assumptions around it began to wobble. And when assumptions wobbled, men died in the spaces between intention and understanding. Patton argued the way he always argued: by outcome. Ground had been taken. German units had been routed. Morale had been lifted in places where exhaustion had threatened to turn into paralysis. In his mind, those facts ended the conversation. War was not a seminar in procedure. War was a race, and he was winning it. The map itself seemed to support him, the pins advancing, the arrows extending forward into enemy territory. Eisenhower answered in a different language, the language of consequence. He spoke of friendly miscoordination that could erupt into tragedy. He spoke of supply chaos, of fuel diverted and wasted because headquarters could not reliably find the very force it was meant to sustain. He spoke of political risk, the headlines that could turn a celebrated advance into a scandal of control. And he spoke, most importantly, of catastrophe, not the kind delivered by a single German counterattack, but the kind that grew from Allied disorder until opportunity became vulnerability. Then came a sentence sharp enough to silence the room. It was not theatrical. It was precise. And when it landed, there was a pause, because even in war, authority needs space to settle. In that silence, everyone understood what was being decided. Not whether Patton was brave, not whether Patton was talented, but whether the war would be run on genius alone or on a structure strong enough to carry genius without breaking. That was the turning point. Eisenhower was not punishing aggression. He was defending the framework that made aggression sustainable, so speed could be supplied, so initiative could be coordinated, so one commander's momentum would not become another commander's confusion. And now the hinge of the entire episode approached. Eisenhower prepared the line that would define the moment, the words that would draw the boundary between a legend's freedom and an army's need for control. Eisenhower chose his moment the way he chose his campaigns, with timing, with restraint, and with an understanding of what could not be taken back once spoken. The conversation was not staged for witnesses, and it was not delivered as a public rebuke. It was private enough to preserve dignity, but firm enough to be remembered. In wartime headquarters, words were tools. Some were meant to encourage, others to correct. This one had to do both, because Patton was both asset and risk, a man whose talent could accelerate victory and whose habits could fracture the machinery that made victory possible. The message Eisenhower delivered was controlled, unmistakable principle. A commander, he made clear, must remain reachable. Reachability was not etiquette, it was command itself. A commander must remain accountable, because orders written in dust and momentum still had consequences in blood. And a commander must remain aligned, because alignment was the difference between an offensive and a scattering of separate impulses. Eisenhower did not accuse Patton of cowardice or incompetence. He accused him of something more dangerous in a coalition, drifting beyond the system that gave his actions meaning. Eisenhower also did what strong leaders often do in difficult corrections. He acknowledged the win. Patton's gift was real: speed, initiative, the ability to turn uncertainty into movement. Eisenhower understood how rare that was. He understood that armies could become cautious by instinct, that commanders could hide behind procedure when risk was required. Patton did not hide. He pressed forward, and the Germans had paid for it. Eisenhower did not deny that, but he insisted that the gift had to operate inside coordinated command, because even the sharpest blade cut its owner if handled without discipline. Then Eisenhower brought the conversation to the point Patton could not dismiss: coalition reality. Boundaries mattered because allies were not optional. They were the foundation. British and American forces were not simply neighboring units. They were political commitments marching under different flags, watched by different publics, interpreted by different governments. A boundary line on a map was not a clerical detail. It was an agreement of trust. If Patton ignored it, he did not merely risk confusion on a road. He risked tension inside the alliance itself. And in a war this large, tension was a weapon the enemy did not need to manufacture. The enemy only needed to wait for it to grow. The words, "stay in the system," were not a slogan. They were a boundary drawn around Patton's legend. He could move fast. He could go forward, but he could not vanish. Not from his staff, not from his neighbors, not from the supreme commander responsible for the coherence of all Allied action. Eisenhower's principle was simple: initiative was granted, not assumed, and it remained legitimate only as long as it was visible to the structure that could support it. Patton heard those words as constraint, because constraint was what he had always fought against. He had built his identity on motion. He believed the front was the only honest place in war. Yet he also heard something else in Eisenhower's tone, a reminder that even legends answered to someone. Patton might inspire divisions, but Eisenhower had to coordinate armies. Patton might win battles, but Eisenhower had to win a war conducted under the eyes of allies, governments, and history. In that moment, the hierarchy was not personal. It was structural. The war itself demanded it. And here the philosophy turned, quietly but decisively. True authority was not the freedom to disappear. It was the responsibility to be found. Patton believed authority meant being present at the edge of danger. Eisenhower insisted authority also meant being present to the system, reachable when decisions had to be synchronized, accountable when resources had to be assigned, and predictable enough that others could act with confidence around him. In modern war, freedom without legibility became a threat to the very cause it sought to advance. Eisenhower's approach became, in miniature, a template of leadership under pressure. Praise the win, because denying reality only breeds resentment. Correct the risk, because ignoring danger only invites catastrophe. Preserve the relationship, because war is too large to waste talent in pride fights. He did not need Patton humbled, he needed Patton connected. He did not need Patton silenced, he needed Patton reachable. And by framing the correction as principle rather than insult, Eisenhower aimed to pull Patton back into alignment without breaking the aggressive spirit that made him useful. Now consequence began to form, even before the ink dried on the message. Patton would either return to a more disciplined pattern, reporting, coordinating, remaining within the legible rhythm of coalition command, or he would resist and force Eisenhower into a harsher choice. Because from this point on, disappearance would no longer be interpreted as daring. It would be interpreted as defiance. And somewhere beyond the maps and pins, the war was tightening, the easy miles ending, meaning the next test would come soon, and it would reveal whether Patton could stay in the system, when the system was the only thing keeping the advance alive. The campaign did not stay in its early rhythm. The open roads that had seemed to promise an endless chase began to narrow, not only in geography, but in possibility. German resistance hardened as it retreated. The easy miles disappeared into rivers that had to be crossed under observation, into towns with stone buildings that turned into fortresses, into weather that slowed engines and turned fields into traps. The enemy, even in retreat, still understood how to make time expensive. This was the moment when Patton's method faced the kind of problem it could not simply outrun. Speed alone could not dissolve prepared defenses. A bridge defended by guns was not persuaded by momentum. A fuel shortage did not care how urgently a commander wanted the column to move. The faster Patton drove forward, the more he collided with the limits that modern war imposed: logistics, terrain, and enemy adaptation. In the early surge, movement had created solutions. Now movement began to create new demands faster than solutions could be delivered. It was here that the system Eisenhower defended proved not bureaucratic, but necessary. Coordinated supply became the difference between an advance and a pause that allowed the enemy to breathe. Air support, timed and integrated, became essential to break strong points without bleeding infantry. Boundary discipline, so often resented in the language of aggressive commanders, became crucial as fronts tightened and adjacent forces moved within closer reach of each other. The war was no longer a wide-open space where one man's instinct could carve a path. It was a crowded battlefield where every action leaned on the actions beside it. A single scene could teach the lesson more clearly than any headquarters memo. A column stalled under rain and intermittent shell fire, engines idling in frustration, crews hunched in their vehicles listening to the dull percussion of distant guns. Ahead, a bridge had been damaged, a culvert blown, the road reduced to a narrow choke point. Momentum, which had seemed unstoppable, was arrested by a gap that could be measured in yards. Engineers worked under pressure. Drivers waited. The war did not care how far Patton had come yesterday. It cared whether the next 100 yards could be crossed today. And in that stalled column, the turning point truth settled. The deeper the advance, the more war punishes individualism. The farther an army moves from its ports and depots, the more it becomes dependent on coordination. Not just between units, but between functions: fuel and firepower, repair and movement, air and ground, plan and execution. A commander who tried to live entirely at the front could still inspire, but inspiration could not build bridges or conjure gasoline. Patton's forward obsession did not become worthless, but it became less decisive as the war shifted into something slower and heavier. A siege of logistics fought along roads and rivers. The campaign began to demand patience, synchronization, and a discipline that could survive bad weather and stubborn defenses. And as the easy miles vanished, the drama of Patton's disappearance settled into its meaning. Eisenhower's boundary had not been personal. It had been prophetic, because the war ahead would punish any army that mistook speed for control. When the maps were rolled up and the day's reports stacked into folders, the campaign could be measured in a language that did not care about legend: numbers. Fuel consumption tallied in thousands of gallons that vanished into engines and empty jerry cans. Vehicle losses not only from enemy fire, but from breakdowns, accidents, and mechanical fatigue. Repair hours counted in greasy nights under blackout conditions, men working by lamplight to keep a division moving one more day. In that accounting, distance was not romance. It was a tax, paid steadily, and sometimes paid all at once when the system failed to keep up. 300 miles looked different in that ledger. Every extra mile forward demanded more fuel delivered over longer roads. Every extended line of advance created more vehicles that needed maintenance far from proper depots. The farther the spearhead pushed, the more fragile its arteries became. And fragility did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as delays, small at first, then compounding. A missing part meant a truck sat idle. An idle truck meant a convoy carried less. Less cargo meant a unit received less fuel. Less fuel meant a pause. And a pause, in a campaign built on tempo, could be as decisive as a defeat. Patton's forward style had undeniable power. It inspired units by giving them a sense that the war was moving toward an end rather than circling endlessly around the same suffering. It created surprise. It exploited German disorganization. Yet it also strained networks and opened coordination vulnerabilities. The more Patton treated headquarters as something to leave behind, the more his own success depended on others guessing correctly where he would be tomorrow. War allowed very little room for guessing. It punished wrong assumptions with missed opportunities and friendly confusion. This is where Eisenhower's insistence on procedure revealed its hidden humanity. Procedures were not cold rules for their own sake. They were often life-saving habits that prevented avoidable collisions, delays, and misunderstandings. A clear boundary could prevent two allied formations from converging on the same road under fire. A reliable location report could prevent artillery from shelling a friendly advance. A confirmed supply route could keep fuel from being wasted on a destination that no longer existed. In a war of machines, the smallest administrative certainty could save the lives of men who would never know what had been prevented. One small contrast captured the difference. A convoy rerouted correctly, because a commander's location was known, because a boundary was updated, because a liaison officer had the right information, arrived in time. Fuel cans were unloaded. Engines started. The advance continued. Another convoy, rerouted blindly toward a moving shadow, arrived too late. The unit it sought had moved on, or had already stalled for lack of supply. Hours were lost, and those hours could not be recovered. The outcomes were separated by what looked like paperwork. In reality, they were separated by survival. The lesson was simple, and it undercut the mythology of speed. Operational tempo was not only speed forward, it was predictability backward, the ability of the system to support what the front demanded. The alliance's trust strengthened when commanders remained legible to each other, when neighbors could plan confidently, when headquarters could coordinate without chasing rumors across the map. And so the ledger of distance closed with a sober truth. Victories can be won by impulse, but wars, especially coalition wars, are finished by systems. With time, Eisenhower's fear looks less like irritation and more like foresight. Patton's disappearance was not dangerous only because of what it did to one operation. It was dangerous because of what it could teach. Armies learn by imitation, and successful men create habits that others adopt without understanding the cost. If Patton, celebrated, rewarded, and rarely slowed, was allowed to vanish beyond the system, other commanders would begin to believe they could do the same. Soon the exception would become a style, and a coalition built on coordination would become uncommandable, not through rebellion, but through a spreading culture of personal latitude. That is where governance in war reveals its moral weight. Eisenhower was not managing personalities for comfort. He was managing them because millions of lives depended on coordination as much as courage. The battlefield killed with bullets and shells, but it also killed with errors. Units arriving late, boundaries misunderstood, supply lines clogged, air support mistimed. Governance was the quiet work of preventing those errors from accumulating into catastrophe. It required rules that did not flatter anyone, and enforcement that did not depend on moods. In that sense, discipline was not harshness. It was responsibility distributed across an enormous machine. Patton's legend was undeniably useful. Legends give men a story strong enough to carry them through exhaustion. They make a hard campaign feel like a march toward meaning. But legends are poor at obeying checklists. A legend wants speed, freedom, decisive gestures. A checklist wants confirmation, coordinates, reports, redundancies, the slow, unglamorous steps that keep an army alive. And in modern war, checklists were not trivia. They were survival. They kept convoys from colliding, prevented artillery from firing blind, ensured that airstrikes hit the enemy rather than a friendly column moving one valley over. A young officer could learn this in a single day. He might admire Patton, repeat his sayings, believe that greatness meant ignoring constraints. Then he would watch staff officers scramble when the commander could not be located. He would see how quickly hero worship encouraged exceptions, how men were tempted to excuse what they would condemn in anyone else. In that moment, the officer would understand that admiration, left unchecked, could become a form of disorder. It did not remove responsibility, it relocated it onto everyone else. The political angle sharpened the stakes further. A missing celebrity general was not merely a tactical problem. It could become scandal, panic, or propaganda victory for Germany. If Patton were cut off, captured, or killed while operating beyond clear contact, the story would travel faster than the truth. Allies would question American control. Newspapers would demand explanations. German broadcasters would turn confusion into triumph. The war was fought in public as well as on the map, and Eisenhower could not afford an avoidable spectacle. So his correction was protective, not petty. It was discipline as strategic compassion, a refusal to let admiration endanger lives, a refusal to let one man's style become a template for chaos. Eisenhower's restraint was not softness. It was a hard kind of care, the kind that insists on procedure because procedure keeps people alive. And here, the irony completes itself. Patton became as effective as he did partly because Eisenhower understood how to use him. The man who made Patton useful to the coalition was also the man who had to limit him, because without limits, the legend would eventually consume the system that allowed it to win. In the end, the story returns to the simplest image, the empty chair in the war room. The maps are still there, the pencils still aligned, the pins still pressed into paper that tries to hold a moving front in place. Yet the chair is a reminder that modern command cannot be built on motion alone. Mobility must remain accountable. A war fought by machines, nations, and millions of individuals cannot be steered by disappearance, no matter how brilliant the man who disappears might be. Patton's instinct deserves its respect. Forward presence can turn fear into motion, and motion can save lives. In the exhausted weeks of advance, when men were tempted to slow down simply because slowing down felt human, Patton's speed acted like a kind of force. He shortened the enemy's time to recover. He exploited confusion before it solidified into defenses. He made soldiers believe the end was not an abstract promise, but a direction they could drive toward. That belief mattered. It kept the campaign alive when fatigue threatened to dull its edge. But Eisenhower's principle deserves equal respect because it is the principle that finishes wars rather than merely accelerates them. Without structure, motion becomes waste. Waste becomes delay. Delay gives the enemy time. In a coalition, waste also becomes mistrust, and mistrust is a slow poison. Eisenhower understood that the war was not only a series of battles, it was a system of relationships, supplies, schedules, and shared understanding. If that system lost coherence, the Allies could still win victories and yet fail to convert them into final decision. A small human memory captures the truth better than any headquarters doctrine. Years later, a veteran might not remember the speeches or the famous lines. He might not even remember the exact towns or the dates. But he would remember the orders that arrived on time, the clear instruction that told his unit where to go, what was expected, and when support would come. He would remember the moment fuel arrived before the tanks went dry, or artillery fired when it was needed, rather than after it was too late. Those memories were not about hero worship. They were about reachability. Someone, somewhere, had remained connected enough for the system to work. And that is where the philosophical lesson settles, quiet and firm. The greatest generals are not those who vanish into the front. and become myths. They are those who keep an army coherent while it moves, who understand that courage and coordination are not rivals, but partners. The romantic image of leadership is a man at the edge of danger. The modern truth of leadership is a man who can be found when the entire machine needs his decision. Eisenhower's words, "Stay in the system," remain as a boundary between heroism and responsibility, not because they denied boldness, but because they protected boldness from becoming self-destruction. In a war decided by distance, fuel, radios, and trust, the most dangerous temptation was to believe that speed alone was command. Patton vanished 300 miles into the war, until Eisenhower reminded him that even speed must report back to the system that makes victory possible.